She cannot speak. She clears the plates. She keeps her eyes down. The lords mock the girl who never answers back. 12 years of silence, earned with blood and fire. Then the doors open. The greatest king on the continent walks in, and the hall goes quiet. Not because of him, because of what he does next. He crosses the room. He stops in front of the servant girl, and he bows. The question is not why. The question is, when did it begin? She learned to be invisible the same way most girls learn their letters. One careful lesson at a time. One correction pressed into the skin. The hall of Lord Ferreth's keep was not built for warmth. The walls were the color of old bone, and they sweated cold even in midsummer. And the rushes on the floor were changed twice a year whether they needed it or not. Which was to say, they always needed it. But Lord Ferreth was not a man who spent coin on comfort he couldn't see. The smell of the place was the first thing you learned, if you served here. Candle tallow, and under that, something animal. Something of the yard, and beneath both of those the particular cold stone smell of a building that had never quite been warm enough to dry all the way through. Mira had lived inside that smell for 6 years. She knew it the way she knew her own breathing. Not consciously, just as the world. She moved through the hall the way water moves through a crack. Not sliding, not hurrying. Just finding the shape of every gap and filling it and moving on. Her steps were soft enough that you didn't hear her cross from the door to the long table, though the table seated 40 and the distance was not small. She had learned that particular softness the hard way 3 weeks into her service, when the steward Aldrich had thrown a heel of bread at her for startling him. He had good aim. The bruise had taken 10 days to yellow. She set the platter down at the far end of the table, near the empty seats. Lord Ferreth's guests had not yet arrived, and the hall was occupied only by the younger knights and 2 of the lord's daughters, who were practicing their lutes and producing something between music and the sounds a cat makes, falling from a sill. One of the knights glanced at Mira, then glanced away. She was not worth the labor of looking at. She knew that. She relied on it. The knight nearest to her elbowed his companion and said something in a low voice, and they both laughed, and Mira felt the sound of their laughter against the back of her neck and kept moving. She had a face that people remembered wrong. She was not plain. Her features were symmetrical in the way a field is symmetrical, which is to say that symmetry alone does not make a thing beautiful. And this was something her features seemed to know about themselves, and had arranged accordingly to produce only a kind of quiet usefulness of form. Her hair was brown, and she wore it pinned back so tightly it seemed to be holding her face in place. She was slight. She was small-handed. She had a scar across the back of her left hand that ran from the base of her little finger to just above the wrist, and when she carried platters and the scar was visible, people sometimes looked at it longer than they looked at her face. She preferred this. The scar was less exposing. She signed, sometimes, to the other servants. It was not the court sign of the houses, which was an elaborate and rarely used formal language for the deaf nobility, which she was not, but something she had invented and taught over years, small and practical, and shared now among the 6 of them who worked the lower hall. It meant she could communicate. It meant she was not entirely sealed inside herself. But she did not sign where the lords could see. In the lords' hall, she was mute. That was the word they used, and she had stopped flinching at it 3 years ago, and now used it to describe herself in her own internal narration without emotion, the way you describe the weather. Mute, servant, Mira, 3 things in order of how much they mattered to Lord Ferreth. She was lifting an empty wine jug to carry it back to the kitchen when Aldrich the steward appeared at her shoulder. He was a tall man who had been thin in youth and added breadth over the years without adjusting his own self-image, so that he moved through the world with the particular confidence of someone who still believed he was taking up less space than he was. He had small pale eyes and a habit of standing too close to the servants when he addressed them, which was not an accident. His breath was sour this close. She did not look up. Girl. He always called her that. Never Mira, though he knew the name. She'd watched him read it off the household ledger twice. They're arriving within the hour. You'll take the far end of the table, and you'll keep your head down, and you'll refill the cups when they're empty, and you will not look at the guests. Not these guests. She dipped her chin. Yes, she understood. She always understood. Understanding was a skill she'd developed to replace the skill of protest. The Alpha King's party. The steward's voice dropped on those words in a way she couldn't quite interpret, some mixture of something like reverence and something much less clean. You know what that means. She didn't move. She didn't know what it meant, except in the vague way that everyone in the borderlands knew it. The Alpha King Emeric had not visited this part of his territory in 11 years, and his visits tended to reorganize things. And Lord Ferrith had been wound tight for 2 weeks of preparation, and had taken it out on the kitchens and on the servants, in proportion to how little he could control events. "It means you don't exist," Aldrich said. "More than usual." He walked away. She watched the floor where he'd stood for a moment, then shifted the jug to her other hand and went back to the kitchen. Her hands were signing something to themselves before she caught it, the small habitual gesture that meant something like, "Careful," or perhaps "quiet," or perhaps "watch." She wasn't always sure which. The gestures had started as deliberate communication, and somewhere in the last 6 years had migrated partly into a private language of thought, which happened when the only way you could speak was with your hands. And even that speech was mostly done alone. She pressed the back of her scarred hand briefly against her thigh. Watch. The banquet began before the light failed. Lord Ferrith had spent money he couldn't spare on beeswax candles. The tallow ones relegated to the kitchens and the servants' sleeping corners. And the hall glowed with a warmth it didn't feel. The guests arrived in stages. The lord's vassal families and the 2 neighboring minor lords first, filling the seats with noise and wine and the smell of wet horses and perfume, used too heavily to cover the absence of bathing. Then the more important guests, 3 delegations from the border fortresses, who smelled like metal and rope and came in already arguing about road toll percentages, which they did not stop arguing about once seated. Mira moved among them with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to carry a full pitcher without a sound. She refilled cups. She collected bones. She moved the empty platters and replaced them with full ones from the relay of kitchen girls who appeared at the hall's side door and disappeared again before they could be seen. There was an art to this. She had mastered it. The hall's smell was different now. Ale and meat and the hot grease of roasted things, human warmth and candle smoke, and something else riding underneath all of it that she couldn't name. Something that arrived before the main doors opened and registered not as a smell, exactly, but as a feeling against the inside of her nose, the way weather registers before the clouds. Then the doors opened. The noise in the hall didn't stop. It continued for several seconds, with the particular inertia of a crowd that hasn't processed what it's seeing yet. The way thunder continues after the lightning has already happened. And then it tapered. Not to silence, to something muffled and attentive, the sound of 40 people who are still technically producing noise but have directed all their actual attention elsewhere. He was not what she'd expected. She was at the far end of the table, half behind a column, and she had a clear sightline to the doors, and she looked despite herself. Despite Aldrich's explicit instruction, despite 6 years of downcast practice, because the feeling in the hall had changed in a way she didn't have a word for, and her body responded to it before her discipline could catch up. He was tall. They were always tall in the stories. She knew that, and she had discounted it. But the reality of it was different from the discount. He was tall the way the ridge above the north pasture was tall. You didn't realize the scale until you had something else to compare it to. and when the men of Lord Ferreth's escort moved to flank him, the comparison made itself immediately and unavoidably. Dark hair, a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone who had spent more time on structure than on approachability. He had his hands clasped behind his back, and he moved through the bowing lords of Ferreth's household with the ease of a man crossing a familiar room, acknowledging without looking, receiving without effort, and his eyes, moving, cataloging, taking in the hall with a sweep that was not casual, were the particular amber gray of autumn light on water. He wore no crown. She hadn't expected that. The stories always included a crown. He wore a dark surcoat and a belt of worked leather, and on the belt, she had to look twice because it seemed wrong, seemed out of a small carved whistle on a leather cord. Not more than 3 inches long, dark wood, smooth from handling, hung with the carelessness of something a man touches without thinking about touching. The way you carry a thing you've carried for so long, it has become part of the weight of yourself. She looked at it for 2 full seconds. Then she looked away. She went back to the cups. She was refilling the wine at the midpoint of the table, her back partially turned, working steadily in the way she'd learned to work. Present without presence, visible only in function, when something changed in the room again. Not noise. Movement. A shift in the quality of the air, the particular sensation of attention moving, the way a flock of birds in flight all adjusts to a single pivot. She registered it too late. She looked up. He was crossing the room toward her, not toward the table. Not toward Lord Ferreth, who was following with a face that couldn't quite settle on an expression. Not toward any of the guests. Across the room, past the table, through the gap between the column and the wall, where she had been invisible for 6 years and 4 months, and was suddenly, starkly, catastrophically not. She didn't move. She couldn't. There are moments the body recognizes before the mind does, and this was one of them, a recognition that bypassed thought entirely, that moved through her in a wave from her throat down to her hands, which were very still on the pitcher. He stopped in front of her. She looked at him. She couldn't help it, couldn't achieve the downward gaze that would have saved her. And he was close. Close enough that she could smell the winter on his coat, and something under that, something warm and clean and animal. Something that her blood responded to before she could think the word for it. He smelled like pine forest after cold rain. He smelled like something she had encountered once and then tried very hard to forget. He held her gaze for one long moment. His eyes were not amber gray, she realized now. They were amber gold. There was a scar through his left eyebrow, old, white seamed, crossing the brow at an angle that made him look perpetually skeptical. But his expression right now was not skeptical at all. It was something else, something she couldn't name because it was too concentrated and too quiet for the noisy room they were standing in, and it made the back of her throat ache in a way that alarmed her. He bowed. Low. Unmistakable. Not a tilt of the head, not the social angle of an equal greeting and equal, but a genuine bow, shoulders inclined, one hand crossing to his chest. The bow you gave to someone whose rank demanded it, which meant a queen or a council lord, or someone whose claim was older than the room they stood in. He bowed it to her. To Mira, who was standing in the rush-smelling, near dark of a minor lord's hall with a wine pitcher in her hands, and her hair pinned back too tightly and 6 years of invisibility, suddenly stripped away like a candle cover lifted off. The hall held its breath. Every conversation that had been tapering since his entrance stopped entirely. The laughter that had been building at the far end of the table, some joke about the mute girl who'd spilled wine last midsummer, cut off so abruptly she could hear the absence of it. No one spoke. He straightened. His amber gold eyes came back to hers. He said nothing. He didn't explain. He didn't look around to check who was watching or what they made of it. He simply looked at her the way you look at something you have been trying to find for a very long time, And then he turned and walked back toward the high seat where Lord Ferreth was standing with his mouth open, and his carefully cultivated deference now struggling against naked bafflement. Mira's hands were shaking. She put the pitcher down on the edge of the table before anyone could see it. She looked at the floor, then at her own hands, the scar on the left one. The fingers which had been signing, she realized, the private small gesture that meant, I know you, or perhaps, you are real. She wasn't sure which, and she pressed her hand against her thigh and held it still. In the 6 years she had served in this hall, no one had looked at her the way he just had. No one had bowed to her. No one had seen her. The laughter did not come back. The banquet proceeded, but it had a different shape now. The shape of a room that is trying to return to its own business, and finding that it can't quite, because a mystery has been introduced into it that none of the available categories will accommodate. Lord Ferreth's guests were not unobservant people. Minor lords always were observant. It was how they stayed minor lords rather than becoming cautionary tales. And they could recategorize a great deal. They could absorb a slight, a deliberate insult, a public favor to a rival, a complex political gesture meant to communicate something between rulers that the lesser attendees were not meant to fully parse. They could not absorb what they had just seen, because a king does not bow to a servant girl, not by accident, not in front of 40 witnesses, not with that particular quality of intention. Mira felt the room's attention on her for the rest of the evening the way you feel a draft under a door, not seeing the source, but unmistakably cold, moving across her skin whenever she crossed the open floor between the column and the table. She kept her eyes down. She kept moving. But she was not invisible anymore. And the sensation of being visible was so foreign, after 6 years, that it registered as something close to pain. Aldrich found her at the side door when she was carrying out a tray of picked bones. He stopped her with a hand on her arm, and she turned, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not the contemptuous efficiency that was his usual register, not the occasional flash of cruelty when a servant dropped something. He looked uncertain. It was, she realized with a shock like cold water, almost worse. What was that? He said. It was not a question. It was more like someone speaking aloud while they tried to think. She looked at him. She could not answer. She had never been able to answer him. He looked at her hands. She kept them still. She had never signed in front of him, had never let him know there was a language she could use, had kept even that much invisible because you never knew what a man like Aldrich would do with something like that, what he would take or forbid or use. The king did not explain, Aldrich said. The king has not explained. The words came out with the specific, tight quality of a man who finds the absence of explanation personally threatening. You will stay at this end of the hall. You will not approach his party, whatever this is. He stopped. You understand. She dipped her chin. She understood. He held on to her arm for a moment longer than necessary, and she felt the grip and thought. The grip means fear, and fear means danger, and danger means be still, be small, be nothing. She had a year's experience reading the grip of men who had power over her, and this grip said something was shifting, and Aldrich did not like things that shifted. He let go. She carried the tray out. Behind her, through the closing door, she heard the banquet resume. Louder now, with the particular defiant loudness of a room trying to prove to itself that it wasn't still thinking about something. In the kitchen, the other girls looked at her. Sepha, who was 15 and had been assigned to the keep 2 winters ago, and was not yet fully fluent in the small private sign language Mira had taught, signed the wrong word twice before switching to the one that meant him, and widened her eyes into a question. Mira considered the question. She signed back, later. Then she signed, careful, and then the small gesture she had developed for something like, the walls have ears, or perhaps, not now, or perhaps simply, quiet. Sepha nodded and went back to scrubbing. Mira stood at the kitchen's small high window for a moment. The night outside was clear and cold, and the stars were very sharp in the way that meant frost coming. She could see a sliver of the courtyard, the horses from the king's party still being rubbed down by grooms, their breath rising in white clouds. She watched one of the horses' nose against the groom's shoulder. The groom didn't push it away. Her hands moved, the gesture for, "I remember you," and then, catching herself, she pressed them flat against the window ledge. She remembered the smell of him, pine forest after cold rain. She remembered a different night 3 years and more before this one. She made herself stop remembering. He was there in the morning. She had thought. She had hoped. She corrected herself, in the honest part of her mind, because hope and thought were not the same thing. That the previous evening might resolve itself into something forgettable in daylight, something that could be quietly buried under the accumulated earth of 6 more years of invisibility. That was how she handled things. You buried them, and you walked on top of the ground you'd made, and eventually it held your weight, and eventually you forgot there was anything beneath it. He was in the great yard when she came out with the kitchen ash bucket at dawn, sitting on the well coping with his coat open despite the cold, and he was looking at the sky. Just looking. Not with the purposeful expression of a man conducting business or the performed ease of a man who wants to be seen relaxing. Just someone who had found a quiet moment and was using it. He turned when she came through the door. She stopped. For a long moment, neither of them did anything. Then, very slowly, he raised his right hand, and he signed, "Good morning," not the formal court sign. The small, practical sign of the private language she had invented among the servants of Ferreth's lower hall. A language that had no written form and no teaching, and that she had never taught to anyone outside those walls. Good morning. 2 signs. Simple, unmistakable in her own vocabulary. Her pitcher hit the ground before she knew she'd dropped it. It didn't break. It was wood, but it clattered and rolled, and the sound of it filled the courtyard, and she did not move to pick it up. She stared at him. He watched her stare, and he did not look away, and the expression on his face was very careful, very still, the face of a man who is trying not to frighten someone who has very good reasons to be frightened. She signed. How? It was the only thing she could make her hands do. He signed back, in the language she had made. "I have had a long time to learn." Her hands were shaking again. She registered this from a distance, the way you register someone else's shaking. She signed. "Why?" His hands answered, slow and clear, the way you speak to someone you're afraid of losing to misunderstanding. "Because I needed to be able to speak to you. If I found you." She looked at him, at the scar through his eyebrow, the gold amber eyes, the carved whistle on his belt that caught the early light and threw it back in a way she had seen before, in a different light, on a different morning, on someone with those same amber gold eyes younger by a decade, and hollowed with cold and with the particular gauntness of a man who has been wounded and is fighting the fever of it. She looked at the whistle. She had made that whistle. She had made it from a green branch she'd cut with the small knife she'd kept. And she had given it to him because he had told her, in the wordless pantomime of a man too feverish to stand, and a girl who could not speak, that he had a daughter, and his daughter liked sounds, and the soldiers had taken everything from him on the field, and he didn't know if she was. She had made him the whistle. She had pushed it into his hand on the last night before she'd had to leave, when the ice on the stream had begun to melt, and she could hear the sound of horses. And she knew the men would come looking for him soon, and she did not know if they were his men or the other kind. And she had run. She had run, and she had never known what happened to him. She had never known if he had lived. Her hands were not shaking anymore. They were very still. Everything in her was very still, the way the world goes, still before something cracks. Not ice, but something larger. Something she had been standing on for years. the ground she had made of buried things. He was still looking at her, waiting with the particular patience of a man who has had years to practice it. She signed. "You lived," his hands answered very gently. "I lived." He did not tell the court anything. This was, she understood gradually over the following 2 days, a deliberate choice. Lord Ferreth demanded explanation. Not directly, not from the king, which would have been an offense of protocol he couldn't afford, but through every available indirect channel. He sent his seneschal to make inquiries of the king's attendants. He contrived to raise the topic at dinner, in the form of general philosophical questions about station and ceremony that were the conversational equivalent of a man pointing directly at something while pretending to look elsewhere. He asked his wife to make gentle inquiry of the king's steward. He got nothing from any of these efforts, and the nothing was returned so consistently and with such smooth completeness that it was obviously deliberate. The king was not explaining the bow. What he did instead was more disquieting for the court to manage. He saw her. Not continuously, not obtrusively. But wherever Mira moved through the hall or the yard, there was a quality of awareness from the king's direction. Not staring, not summoning, not any of the things that would have been legible and therefore manageable, just awareness. The way you're aware of a source of warmth in a cold room without looking directly at it. The other servants noticed. Sepha, who shared Mira's sleeping corner and had been watching the court's reaction with the sharp-eyed attention of someone young enough to still find these developments interesting rather than threatening, signed to her late on the second night that the Lord's older daughter had been asking questions about Mira below stairs. Not cruel questions, Sepha clarified in the particular small signs of their shared language. Confused ones. The questions below stairs were mild. Mira was more alert to the questions in Aldrich's eyes. He watched her now with something she could only call calculation. She'd grown up around calculated attention. Her mother had had that look, the look of someone working a sum, running a count, figuring a cost. And she recognized it in Aldrich the way you recognize a key that fits a particular lock. He was deciding something. She didn't know what. She kept moving and kept her face still and kept the scarred hand tucked close to her body when she could and kept working. On the third evening, the king asked Lord Ferreth for the use of the inner courtyard for his wolves. This was phrased as a request, which made it, by the particular etiquette of power, an absolute requirement, and Lord Ferreth said, of course, yes, naturally, with the kind of expansive hospitality that is indistinguishable from terror. The inner courtyard was cleared of everything except moonlight and stone, and Mira, who had no reason to be there and every reason to be in the kitchen, stood at the edge of the archway that looked into it. The king's wolf was not black, as the stories said. He was dark, the darkest gray that was almost not quite black, the color of deep water before dawn. And he was large in the way that made you recalculate the size of the room around him. His eyes in wolf form were the same amber gold. He moved through the moonlit courtyard with the exact same ease the man had moved through Lord Ferreth's hall, utterly certain of his right to every inch of space he occupied. She should have gone back to the kitchen. She stayed. He came around the courtyard in a long, slow circuit, and she thought he might not notice her, tucked in the shadow of the archway, but he was a wolf, and she understood now something she had understood. Perhaps, on some level, in a different winter, in a different dark, that his nose was as much a part of him as his eyes, and her scent was not something she could hide. He came to her. He stopped in front of her. And he was very close, and he was very large, and she could feel the warmth of him from where she stood. He smelled like pine forest and winter, like the familiar thing, like the thing she had been trying not to remember for 3 years. She put her scarred hand out. She wasn't sure why. Some instinct older than decision. He put his great head under it. The fur was thick and warm, unexpectedly warm, and she could feel the weight of his skull under her palm, the steady animal breathing, the warmth of him rising up through her hand and into her wrist and up her arm like something thawing. They stayed like that for a long time. No one came into the inner courtyard. The moon moved. The cold deepened, and she didn't feel it. She thought about a winter in the borderland forest, about a lean-to she'd built from what she could find, about melting snow in a dented bowl over a small fire, about a man who ran a fever for 9 days and called out in his delirium for a daughter. And for something else she hadn't understood then, a name she'd heard him say over and over in the dark of his fever, like a compass bearing he was trying to hold to. She hadn't known what the name meant. She hadn't thought to wonder. She had just kept the fire going. She had just kept the snow melting. She had just sat on her side of the lean-to and watched him breathe, because he was a person and he was dying, and she could not have left him any more than she could have spoken. She had always thought that was the end of it, that she'd left, and he'd been found by his own, and she had moved on, and the war had moved on, and eventually she'd ended up here, in Farath's hall, 6 years of ash buckets and candle stubs and Aldrich's sour breath, and the quiet and private language of hands. She had not thought he remembered. She had not thought he'd been looking. She had not let herself think about that possibility, because hope, in her experience, was a thing that required enormous upkeep, and she didn't have the resources for it. Hope cost. She'd learned to manage without. The wolf breathed against her hand, and she kept it very still. She was alone in the corridor, outside the storage room the next morning when he found her. The man, not the wolf, though the warmth was the same. He came around the corner, without the escort that attended him everywhere else, and she understood from that alone that this was deliberate. That the escort had been given other tasks, that he had maneuvered for this. She held the ash bucket she was carrying. She didn't know what to do with her hands. That was new. She always knew what to do with her hands. He signed. "Can we speak?" She put the ash bucket down on the floor. The corridor was cold and narrow and smelled of old stone and cooking fire, and they were close enough in it that she could see the exact angle of the old scar through his eyebrow and the way his hands moved when he signed. Carefully, precisely, with the deliberateness of a man who has learned something he was afraid to learn wrong. She signed. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then his hands moved slowly. In the war, 3 years ago, I was wounded on the Greywater field. My company was separated. I was taken down by a bolt to the side and a sword to the ribs. She watched his hands. I woke in a lean-to in the borderland forest, he signed. Someone had built a fire. Someone had dressed the wound. Someone brought me water and food and stayed. His hands paused. She never spoke. I didn't know for a long time that she couldn't. I thought. He stopped. His jaw tightened briefly, the only break in the careful stillness of his face. I thought she chose not to speak to me. I thought perhaps she was afraid. I thought. He signed. I thought she would be there in the morning. I thought I would have a chance to ask. His hands stopped moving. She understood the shape of what came next. She had lived it, after all, the other side of the same story. She had heard the horses and she had run. Because you didn't know, in a war, whose horses they were. And she had been a girl alone in a forest with a man she didn't know, and the choice between being found with him and not being found at all had been very clear. She signed. The horses frightened me. His eyes changed. Something in them shifted, loosened, the way ice loosens, in the first warmth. He signed. I know. I have told myself this for 3 years, and it has not entirely helped. She looked at him. He looked at her. She signed. The whistle. He looked down at it, at the small carved piece of wood on his belt, and put one hand over it, not covering it, just resting there. The way you rest a hand on something you've been carrying so long you've stopped distinguishing it from yourself. He signed. My daughter's name is Lyra. She is 4 years old. I was in the forest for the winter campaign when she was born, And by the time I came back, she was 3 months old and had already discovered that sounds could be made, and that making them was excellent. He paused. She would like you. Mira's hands were still. She didn't sign. There was too much to sign, and her hands didn't know where to start, and so she just looked at him, at the scar and the amber gold eyes, and the careful, deliberate hands of a man who had learned language engines in secret to speak to someone he might never find. She managed. How did you find me? His hands. I went back to the forest when the war ended. There was nothing there. I asked the villagers in the nearest settlement. One of them remembered a girl who couldn't speak. He paused again. It took 2 years. You covered your tracks well, she thought. I was not covering my tracks. I did not know there were tracks to cover. She signed this. He watched her sign it, and something moved through his face that she could not name, and did not want to name, because if she named it, she would have to decide what to do with it. And she was not ready to decide anything. She was standing in a cold corridor in Lord Ferreth's keep with an ash bucket at her feet, and she was not ready for anything. She signed. I did not know you were the king. He signed. Would it have mattered? She thought about this honestly. She thought about the lean-to, and the 9-day fever, and the dented bowl, and the whistle she'd cut from a green branch. She thought about the man she'd watched breathe, which was not a thing you did at a distance, which was not a thing you did for a person who was furniture. She signed, no. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he signed, very carefully. I owe you a debt I cannot repay with gold. She signed back before she could stop herself. I did not do it for gold. Something in the corridor changed. Some quality of cold, some quality of distance. She felt it in her throat first, that ache again, the one she didn't have a name for. He signed, I know. Then, after a pause, what do you need? She thought about the question, what she needed. It was not a category of thought she'd cultivated. Need was what you kept small so it didn't become a problem. She signed, I need nothing. He looked at her hands when she stopped signing. He said, aloud, for the first time, in a low voice that was very different from any voice she'd heard in this hall, lower and quieter, the kind of voice that expected to be listened to, rather than announcing itself. You gave me winter. You gave me 9 days of fire when I was burning. You gave my daughter. He stopped. He was looking at the whistle. She sleeps with it. She's 4 years old and she sleeps with it. The ash bucket was between them. She looked at it. She looked at her hands. She signed, then we are even. He shook his head. Not at the sign. He was already answering before her hands finished. We are not even. He said it quietly. And I am not leaving you here. She thought about those words. She thought about them while she carried the ash bucket to its place, and came back for the kitchen water, and scrubbed the prep table, and stood over the kitchen fire until the warmth reached through her dress to her skin. She turned them over in her mind the way you turn a strange coin, feeling for the edge, testing the weight. Not leaving you here. It was not, she told herself, what it sounded like. He was the Alpha King. He ran a territory that stretched 4 days' ride in 3 directions and held 11 lords and managed the borderlands defense and presumably had things to do with his time other than make decisions about where mute servant girls spent their lives. He meant something practical. He meant something about debts and obligations and the particular language of power that she didn't speak and had never needed to. He did not mean what her body had heard when he said it, which was something warmly terrifying, something that moved through her with the same involuntary quality as the scent of him on his coat, pine forest, and cold rain, something she could not choose and could not stop, and had spent 3 years believing was simply memory. She went on with the morning. The cook, Bressa, who was 50 and had been in Ferreth's kitchen since before the war, and who watched everything from under her eyebrows without appearing to watch, said nothing when Mira came back in. But she put a heel of bread and a piece of cheese on the prep table where Mira worked and said, loudly, to no one, that there was leftover bread that needed eating. Because if you kept the bread overnight, the rats got into it, and then she went back to the fire. Mira ate the bread. Her throat was tight enough that she ate it in very small pieces, but she ate it. Sefa appeared at her elbow sometime mid-morning and signed, extremely quietly, with the smallest possible gestures. The tall lords are talking, lots of talking, about you, Mira signed, I know. Sefa, Aldrich is making a face. Mira, which face? Sefa thought, then signed the word that in their private language meant something like, the face he makes when he is about to make a problem someone else's fault. Mira was still for a moment. She signed, watch him. Sefa, already am. This was the thing about invisibility, Mira thought, returning to the prep table. It was a protection, but it was also a community. 6 years of silence in Lord Ferris Hall, and she had made a language, and the language had built a small hidden world. And in that world she was not the mute servant girl. She was the person who had built the language. And that was different. That was something no one in the great hall had thought to take from her, because they hadn't looked far enough to find it. She thought about Emeric signing good morning with her hands, in her vocabulary, the small private language she had invented, and she thought about what that meant. Not just that he'd learned it, but that he had found out it existed. That he had gone looking for that, too. In the years he was looking for her, her hands moved. Just slightly, against the prep table, not signing anything, just moving. The 4th day was when Aldrich acted. She should have been less surprised. She had known the face Sefa described. She had catalogued it in her internal taxonomy, under things to be watched, and she had thought she was watching. But the kitchens was loud that morning, and Bressa was berating someone about the quantity of salt in the porridge, and she was at the far end of the prep table when Aldrich came in. He did not come for Mira. He came for Sefa. He had in his hand a small piece of cloth, the kind used to wrap candles for transport, and he told Sefa in his particular carrying voice that 3 tallow candles had gone missing from the storage room and had been found. He flourished the cloth. Wrapped in this, hidden behind the kitchen yard door, and did Sefa know anything about it? Sefa's face went the particular pale of someone who knows they are being looked at and does not know why. She did not know anything about the candles. Mira knew this because she was the one who had put the candles behind the door. 2 days ago, in a moment of complete stupidity, a moment of forgetfulness that had nothing to do with theft, and everything to do with carrying too many things at once, and setting something down and meaning to come back and not coming back. They were her candles, in the sense that the word meant she was responsible for the error. Aldrich looked at Sefa, and Sefa looked at Aldrich, and Sefa's mouth opened, and Mira put down the knife she was using to cut bread and stepped forward. She moved in front of Sefa. She faced Aldrich. He looked at her. His small, pale eyes moved from her face to her hands, which were signing. Slowly, deliberately, for the first time in 6 years in his presence, signing clearly and with full knowledge that he couldn't read a word of it. She signed, "It was me." He couldn't read it. He knew she was signing. She watched him realize that this was a language, that she had been holding this card for 6 years, and she watched the calculation move through him. But it was slower than usual, disrupted by something else, by the question of what the king had meant, by the mystery of the bow and the morning meeting he'd heard about by now. She was sure, through the particular intelligence-gathering apparatus of a petty steward. She kept her hands moving, slowly, clearly, so that Sefa could read the signs over Aldrich's shoulder. She signed, "I left them there. An accident. I was carrying too much. Tell him." She saw Sefa's face change, relief, then a quick decision, then, "The candles were there by accident," Sefa said, steadier than her years. Mira was carrying too many things. She set them down and meant to retrieve them. Aldrich looked at Sefa, then at Mira. Something moved through his face. Not belief, she didn't think. He was not a man who believed easily. But something else, a recalibration. the sense of a man who had come to do one thing and found that doing it had become suddenly more expensive than it had been a week ago. He looked at Mira's hands. She let him look. She kept her face still. He said, to Sepha, not to her, "See it doesn't happen again," and walked out. Sepha let out a breath. Bressa, who had been stirring something at the fire and watching with professional discretion, said nothing, but the stirring slowed briefly, then resumed. Mira's hand said, quietly, to Sepha, "All right." Sepha's hands, shakier than she would have liked. "All right, then, you're braver than you look." Mira looked down at her scarred hand. She signed back, and the sign she used was a small one, and in their private language it meant something like, "No, not brave." But she wasn't sure. Standing in the kitchen with the smell of burned porridge and Bressa's fire and Sepha's relief, what the alternative word would have been. Emmerich found out about Aldrich before she could think about whether she wanted him to. She did not tell him. She hadn't decided yet whether to tell him. She was still in the slow and careful process of deciding what she wanted, which was a process she'd neglected for years, and found she was badly out of practice at. The question of want had been simplified for a long time into the question of survive, and those were not the same architecture of thought. But the king's household watched things. That was apparently part of what a household did, and the Alpha King's household did it with a thoroughness that the Lord Ferreth Steward could only have aspired to. And by the 5th day, Emmerich knew about the candles and about Aldrich's manner with the girl he called girl, and about the bread thrown 3 weeks into her service 6 years ago. He did not come to her with this. He said nothing about it. What he did was invite Lord Ferath to a private meeting in the morning and come out of it 3 hours later with an agreement, the particulars of which filtered down through the household with the speed that information moves, in places where information is power. The agreement included, among various provisions about border taxes and road maintenance, and the Ferath household's contribution to the northern defense, a single clause that no one in the Great Hall fully understood, that all household staff currently under Ferath's employ were considered, for the duration of Emmerich's visit, to fall under the direct protection of the Crown, with the Crown's right to review any discipline or dismissal. It was a very small clause. It was the kind of clause that could be overlooked. In any other context, with any other staff, it would have been overlooked. Aldrich did not overlook it. She knew this because Sepha told her, and Sepha had heard it from Gareth the undercook, who had heard it from one of the king's men, who had been rather more forthcoming than king's men typically were, which was its own kind of information. Aldrich had gone to Lord Ferreth with an objection, Sepha said. Lord Ferreth had told him that the clause stood. Aldrich had gone away quiet. Quiet was the most dangerous form Aldrich took. She knew this. She had been cataloging his danger for years in the way you catalog weather, not to stop it, but so you wouldn't be caught by it. She kept working. She kept her eyes down. She stayed within sight of Sepha or Bressa when she could, and when she couldn't, she moved quickly, and she watched the angles of rooms. On the 6th evening, the halls held a second formal dinner. Smaller than the first, the visiting lords beginning to arrange their departures, the household settling into the particular winding-down exhaustion of a prolonged entertainment that had been both expensive and bewildering. Mira moved through it with the practiced stillness she had spent years achieving. But the stillness was different now. Inside it, she was not empty. She was thinking. She was thinking about the question he'd asked. What do you need? She had signed. I need nothing, and that had been the reflex, the long practice diminishing of want, the 6 years of nothing, nothing, until nothing became second nature. But she had been thinking about it since. In the way you prod a bruise, not to hurt yourself but to find the edges of the thing. What she needed, she thought, was not what the word typically meant when kings asked it. She did not need gold. She did not need a room or a gown or a title. She had learned to build warmth out of smaller materials, a private language, bread left on a table, the particular warmth of an animal's head against your scarred hand in a moonlit courtyard. What she needed, and this thought came to her very quietly, in between pouring wine at the near end of the long table, was to be seen. Not strategically, not protectively, not as a debt to be serviced. Just seen. The way he had crossed the room and bowed, not because it served him, not because it impressed the court, but because she was there, and he had been looking for her, and she was real. She was at the midpoint of the table, reaching to refill a cup when Aldrich appeared at her left side. He had timed it well. She would give him that. He had timed it for the loudest moment of the dinner, the moment when the collective attention of the room was directed at a story. Lord Fereth was telling with the expansive gestures of a man who has been drinking since mid-afternoon. He had also timed it for the moment when Emmerich's back was turned, when the king was speaking to one of his own advisors, inclined slightly away from the room. Aldrich put something in her hand. She looked down, a letter, folded and sealed. The seal was Lord Fereth's. He said, very low, close to her ear with the deliberate intimacy that was its own kind of pressure. Your service with this household is terminated, effective at dawn tomorrow. You are directed to vacate the premises. He paused. I suggest you be gone before the king's party wakes. Some goodbyes are better not attempted. He walked away. She stood at the midpoint of the table with the letter in her hand, and the room around her, and the noise continuing, and the candles burning, and her hands very still. She thought, he cannot do this. The Crown's protection clause, she thought. He has Lord Fereth's seal. Lord Fereth has agreed, perhaps under pressure. Perhaps the clause was always thin, she thought. I have been here before. This exact room. Not this one, but a room like it. The moment when something you thought was yours turns out to be held at someone else's pleasure, she thought. I ran, last time, she thought carefully, for a long moment. Do I run again? She was still standing there when she became aware that the quality of the room had shifted. Not loudly, very quietly. The slow, comprehensive awareness that something has changed, the way the temperature changes, and suddenly you know without looking that someone has opened a door. She looked up. Emmerich had turned. He was looking at her hands, at the letter, at the particular stillness of her face which she knew from the inside was very still indeed. His expression was, she searched for the word, not angry. Anger was a hot thing, and this was something colder and more concentrated. The expression of someone who has just finished solving a problem he's been working on for a while. He looked from her to Aldrich's retreating back. She watched him make a decision. He did not walk toward Aldrich. He walked toward her, through the room, through the noise, with the particular unhurried certainty of a man who understands that all these things, the hall, the people in it, the lord at the head of the table, are objects in a space he moves through, and he moved through them and stopped in front of her. He looked at the letter. He looked at her hands. He signed, very small, Are you all right? She thought about it. She signed back, I am deciding. He waited. She stood in the middle of the banquet with the letter in her hands and the room around her, and she thought about running. She had been running, in various forms, for the entirety of her adult life. The running had been sensible, had kept her alive, had been the correct choice. She was not condemning it, she had nothing to be ashamed of in it. But she was standing in a room full of people who had made her invisible for 6 years, and she had a letter in her hands that said she would go on being invisible forever. Somewhere else, in some other hall, clearing some other lord's plates, and she thought, no, that was the whole thought. Just, no. Small and clean and very final. She looked at Emmerich. She signed, I want to speak. His hands answered, immediately. You have always been speaking. Let them hear you. She put the letter on the table, not to Aldrich, not to Lord Fereth, not as a protest or a declaration. She set it on the table next to an empty cup, and she walked to the center of the hall. And she was aware, as she walked, that she was not being invisible. She was not finding the gaps and sliding through them. She was just walking through the space, directly, the way you walk when you have decided that the space belongs to you as much as to anyone. The noise in the room began its gradual reduction. The way noise in a room reduces when something unexpected is happening, not dramatically, just the slow dying out of conversations as the available attention is needed elsewhere. She stopped at the center of the hall. 40-some faces turned toward her. She was a servant in a plain dress with her hair pinned back and a scar on her hand. And she stood in the center of the room, and she was not invisible. She raised her hands. She signed. Deliberately, clearly, with the care she gave to every communication she valued. The same care she'd given to building the private language with the kitchen girls. The same care she'd given to keeping a stranger alive in a lean-to for 9 days. The care that had always been there, in the hands, waiting. She signed in her own language first, to Sepha, who was standing at the side door, and to Bressa, who had appeared there too, and to Gareth, and to the 2 others who came and stood with them, the small faithful audience of the only language that had always been hers. She signed. I was not going to say anything. And from the side door, Emeric answered her aloud, standing there in the low light, speaking in the voice that carried without effort, the voice of a man who had learned to be heard across battlefields and council chambers, translating her words into the air of the room. She says she was not going to say anything. The room went very quiet. She signed. I have been silent in this hall for 6 years. Not because I had nothing to say, because you were not listening. She has been silent in this hall for 6 years. Not because she had nothing to say, because you were not listening. Aldrich, across the room, had gone very still. Lord Ferreth's expression had passed through bafflement and arrived somewhere resembling apprehension. She signed. I have cleared your plates and refilled your wine, and swept the ash from your grates. I have learned the shape of every corner of this hall in the dark. I have been called girl by a man who knew my name, and treated as furniture by people who had all the words in the world and chose to use them only on each other. She has cleared your plates and refilled your wine and swept the ash from your grates. She has learned the shape of every corner of this hall in the dark. She has been called girl by a man who knew her name and treated as furniture by people who had all the words in the world and chose to use them only on each other. Her hands were steady. The steadiness surprised her. She had expected shaking. The shaking of the morning in the courtyard, the shaking of the corridor. But her hands were steady and the words were coming, and the room was full of them, and she was standing in the center of it, and the room was listening. She signed. I did not come here to be seen. I came here because there was nowhere else to. That is the thing about this hall. It takes what it can take, and the things that cannot be taken it calls invisible. She did not come here to be seen. She came here because there was nowhere else to go. That is the thing about this hall. It takes what it can take, and the things that cannot be taken it calls invisible. She paused. She thought about the next thing she wanted to say, and she felt it in her throat, that ache, and she held it for a moment. She signed. I am not invisible. I was never invisible. I was just the only one paying attention. He translated her words. She was not invisible. She was never invisible. She was just as the only one paying attention. And in the silence that followed, something settled over the room like snow. Not softly. Snow is heavier than people think. She looked at Aldrich. She signed, I am not leaving. The translation hung in the air. Aldrich's pale eyes moved to the king, to Lord Ferreth, to the assembled faces of the guests, many of whom were looking at him in a way that had nothing calculated in it, just the particular uncomfortable recognition of people watching someone be found out. He did not say anything. He could not afford to say anything. She understood this clearly, in the way she had understood the arithmetic of power from the beginning of her service. Aldrich had gotten away with what he got away with because no one was watching. But 40-odd people were watching now, and the king was standing at the edge of the hall, and Lord Ferreth was doing a rapid reassessment of whose household guard he actually wanted to trust with his ongoing security. Lord Ferreth said, clearing his throat, adjusting his voice into something he apparently hoped would sound authoritative. "The termination letter is." The steward acted outside his authority. Aldrich said nothing. His face was very controlled. He understood costs. She looked at Lord Ferreth, then at the letter still on the table. She looked at Emeric. She signed, to him, one small private sign, different from the address she'd been making to the room, just to him. The sign that meant enough. He looked at her hands. He translated, but quietly, not a broadcast, enough. Then, in front of the room, in front of Lord Ferreth and Aldrich and the assembled minor lords and their wives, and the kitchen girls at the side door and the knights and the daughters, Emeric walked from the edge of the hall to where she stood in the center of it, and he bowed. The same bow as the first night. Shoulders inclined, hand across his chest, unmistakable and entirely deliberate. But this time she could see his face as he bent. She could see what it cost him, which was nothing, and what it gave him, which was something too specific to name and too warm to look at directly. He held the bow for a long moment. Then he straightened, and his amber gold eyes found hers, and he said, quietly, just for her, in the language of her hands and his, "I have been looking for you for 3 years." She looked at him. She signed back, "I know." Then, after a pause, her hands moving in the slow, careful shapes of her private language, the one she'd invented for a hall that wouldn't hear her, "I am here." She did not leave with him that night. This was her choice. He asked, in the careful way he asked everything, not as a command, not even as a wish, because she was learning the distinction between how he moved in public, with the ease of a man who could make rooms rearrange themselves, and how he moved in private, where he was more careful than anyone would have guessed, more tentative, the tentativeness of someone who has spent 3 years rehearsing a conversation, and arrived at the real thing to find it requires more care than rehearsal. She did not yet know what to call this careful thing. She was not rushing to find the word. She asked for time. He gave it. He gave it in the form of 3 more days in Lord Ferreth's hall, days in which the hall had a different quality entirely. Quieter, not in the empty way of its former silence toward her, but in the purposeful quiet of rooms that are reconsidering themselves. Aldrich was removed from his position as steward by Lord Ferreth, who had performed a rapid calculation and arrived at the conclusion that his household's value was not, in the long view, improved by the presence of a man the Alpha King had reason to remember unfavorably. There was no drama in it. There was just a morning when Aldrich was not at breakfast, and a different man was asking about the salt in the porridge. The kitchen girls were very quiet about this. Sepha signed, "I cannot believe it," and then immediately, "I believe it entirely." And the contradiction was, Mira thought, very honest. On the second of the 3 days, Emeric sat with her in the inner courtyard in the cold afternoon light, and they talked. Not spoke, talked in the language of her hands and his voice, trading information with the careful mutual embarrassment of people who have had a long and significant history, without quite managing to be present for each other in it. He told her about the Greywater field, about the bolt and the ribs and the fever, which had been severe enough that he did not remember much of the first 3 days. He told her about waking to the smell of smoke and the sound of water being heated and the sight of a pair of hands moving at the edges of his sight, steady and competent and managing, the hands of someone who had decided to manage and was getting on with it. He told her about the whistle, about Lyra, who was 4 years old, and strongly opinionated, and had asked him approximately 14 times who made the whistle and why, and whether they were friends of Papa's, and whether they were coming to visit. He told this with a particular mix of exasperation and absolute helplessness that seemed to characterize his relationship with his daughter, and Mira watched his face while he spoke and thought, here is the thing the court does not know about the Alpha King, the thing that the bow had hinted at and the whistle had confirmed. He was not invulnerable. He was just very committed to looking it. She told him, slowly, in the pieces she knew how to hand over, about the war. About the village and the fire and the silence that had come after, the silence that had not been grief or shock alone, but a physical thing. The cords of her throat damaged by smoke and screaming, the voice that the healers said might come back, and had not come back, and had eventually stopped being a thing she waited for. She told him about the years between and the various hells that can constitute a life, when a girl has nothing and no voice, and she has learned that those two facts are connected in the minds of the people she encounters. She told him about Ferris Hall, not with bitterness. Bitterness was a thing she'd worked out of herself because it was heavy and she needed to travel light, but with the flat accuracy of a historian. She told him about the language, about building it, piece by piece, with the kitchen girls, about the particular joy of it, a joy she'd been careful with because joy also had weight, but the joy of building something from nothing, of making a way of speaking where no way had existed. He listened to all of this with the quality of attention that she was beginning to understand was specific to him, full and still, and not reaching ahead to the response, just receiving. It reminded her of the way his wolf had put his head under her hand, the weight of it, the warmth. At the end of the afternoon, with the light going gold and cold across the courtyard stones, she signed. Lyra. He looked at her. She signed. Does she have her mother? He was quiet for a moment. Then, her mother died in childbirth. Lyra doesn't remember her. A pause. Lyra has me, and a very large extended household of people who are all thoroughly outmaneuvered by a 4-year-old. She looked at her hands. She signed carefully. I would like to meet her. The thing that moved through his face was something she'd been trying not to look at directly, because it was too much to look at directly. It was the kind of thing you could only take in from an angle. He said, very quietly, she will adore you. She signed. How do you know? He said. Because you are steady and you build things and you keep fires going. She will know the difference. He looked at the whistle on his belt. She already does. The cold deepened around them and neither of them moved. On the third day, she packed her things. This was a short operation because the things she had were few. A spare dress, a comb, the small knife she'd carried since before the war, a piece of cloth she used for binding her hand in cold weather, and a length of braided cord that had been Sepha's first attempt at making something to carry the knife, and had turned out slightly too short for its purpose and she'd kept it anyway. That was all. The inventory of her life, laid out on the sleeping corner pallet. She looked at it for a long time. Sepha appeared at her shoulder and looked at it too. Sepha signed, eventually. You're going, she signed. I'm going. Sepha, are you afraid? She thought about this honestly. She signed. Yes. Then, are you, Sepha? For you? She nodded. Sepha, a little. But Bressa says to tell you, she paused. Assembling the signing with the care of someone, still building fluency. Bressa says to tell you that you built something here that will not come apart when you leave. That you should know that. Mira looked at her hands. She looked at Sepha's face, 15 years old, and still learning the shapes of things, and she thought about what it meant to build a language in a place that wouldn't hear you, and then leave the language behind. She signed, teach Gareth the winter cold signs. He doesn't have them yet. Sepha, I will. She, and watch Aldrich's replacement, not because he seems bad. Because everyone seems all right until they don't. Sepha, I know. She looked at her palette. She folded the dress and put it with the comb and the knife and the cord and the cloth, and she wrapped it in the spare dress and made a bundle of it, and she held it in her arms. And it weighed almost nothing. She thought, this is my life, it weighs almost nothing. She thought, that is not entirely a sad thing, she thought. I have spent 6 years making myself small enough to carry, and now I am going somewhere and I do not know what size I will be when I arrive, and the not knowing is the terrifying part, and possibly also the best part. She signed to Sepha, "Thank you." Sepha signed back, imprecisely, with the particular imprecision of the deeply sincere. "You taught me everything I know how to say with my hands. That is a very large thing." Mira looked at her for a moment. Then she hugged her, quickly, the brief, fierce hug of people who are not going to cry, because there is no time, and also because, sometimes, you choose not to spend a thing in the moment, you keep it and carry it instead. Sepha held on for 1 extra second and then let go. Bressa was in the kitchen doorway when she passed through. The cook looked at her bundle and then at her face and said, in her carrying voice, as though she were speaking to the fire, "Good." That was all. Good. As a complete sentence, as a whole assessment, as a blessing of the particular compressed and coal-hearted kind that Bressa gave, it was the highest praise Mira had received in 6 years. She pressed her right hand, the unscarred one, briefly against Bressa's arm as she passed. Bressa kept her eyes on the fire. Emeric was waiting in the courtyard with the horses in his household and the particular organized chaos of a significant party preparing to travel. He saw her come through the kitchen door and he crossed to her, and he did not offer to take her bundle, which she appreciated because it was her bundle and it was light, and she was carrying it herself. But he walked alongside her to the horse they'd readied for her, a gray of middle age and sensible temperament, and he said, quietly, while the household was occupied, "Ready?" She looked at him. She looked at the keep behind her, the bone-colored walls, the frost on the yardstones, the smoke from Bressa's kitchen rising into the cold, clear morning. She signed, "Yes." Then, after a moment, "Thank you for not hurrying me," he said. "I was not going to hurry you." She signed. "You were a little impatient," he said, with the flat honesty she was learning to expect from him. "Yes, I was a little impatient." He paused. "I have been looking for you for 3 years. A few days more was not unreasonable, and also, yes, a little impatient." She looked at him. She thought that she had not laughed in so long that the impulse, when it arrived, was something she nearly missed. A small rising warmth in her chest that wanted to come out as sound but had nowhere to go. And she let it move through her anyway. And she thought he saw something in her face. Because his expression changed into something that was not quite a smile, but was the architecture of one. The place a smile lives in a face that doesn't use it often. She mounted the gray horse. The bundle was secured to the saddle. She settled her weight and looked at the keep one more time, and then turned her face toward the road. Beside her, Emeric mounted. His household fell into formation around them, and the column began to move, and the gates of Lord Ferreth's keep opened ahead of them, and she rode through. The road was cold and clear, and the frost was already burning off in the new light, and the horse's breath rose in white clouds, and she could feel the morning coming alive around her, the particular aliveness of cold air, when the sun is just beginning to have an effect on it, warmth arriving in layers. She rode next to the Alpha King. He did not speak. She did not sign. The road stretched ahead. His hand, after a while, moved to the carved whistle at his belt, not deliberately. The habitual touch of something carried so long it has become part of the weight of yourself, she thought. In some other world, a world that knew what she knew, that she had kept this man alive for 9 days, in the cold dark of the borderlands while the world went on without either of them. The court that had mocked her would have known a different story. They might have told it differently. They might have made different choices with their laughter, she thought. But the world that knows what she knows is very small, and it is this road, and this morning, and the man riding next to her who had learned her language in secret. She thought, that is enough. That is more than enough. She thought, finally, with the fullness of something she had not allowed herself in a very long time. That is mine. Her hands moved, not to sign anything, just to feel the cold air between her fingers. The sensation of moving through the world with open hands. The road went on. The morning went on. The warmth came slowly and surely, the way warmth comes when it means to stay. She met Lyra 6 days later. The child was standing at the top of the main stairs when they rode through the gates of Amerik's keep, and she was exactly as Mira had imagined her. Small, extremely upright, in the way of children who have learned that uprightness is a form of authority. With her father's amber gold eyes, and her father's jawline, and a quantity of dark hair that was doing whatever it pleased. She was 4 years old. She looked like a small person who had extremely detailed opinions about everything and was prepared to share them. She looked at Mira. She looked at her hands, at the scarred one and at the unscarred one. She signed imperfectly with child-sized signs that were clearly being reproduced from memory. A single careful sign that Mira recognized because she had made it. Hello. Mira's throat did the thing it did now when things were too large to manage quietly. She let it. She looked at the small serious face and the small uncertain hands. She signed back. Hello. Lyra looked at her father. She said, loudly, with the carrying volume of someone who has never been told to keep it down. She understands. Amerik said. From beside Mira. Yes. Lyra looked back at Mira. She said, Papa has been practicing the talking with hands for a very long time. He said he had a person to find. Are you the person? Mira looked at the child. She looked at her hands, and she looked at the small, serious face, and she thought about lean-tos and green branches, and 9 days fevers, and 6 years of ash buckets, and a language built from nothing in a hall that wouldn't listen. She signed. Yes, Amerik translated as he had been translating for her since the first morning in the courtyard, as she suspected he would translate for as long as she needed. As she suspected she would need less and less, as the world of his household learned her language, as the girls in his kitchen would learn it, as his advisors would learn it, as Lyra herself was already learning it, with her small careful hands and her father's amber gold eyes. She says yes, he said. She is the person. Lyra considered this. Then she came down 2 steps and held out the wooden whistle she had in her hand, dark wood, child smooth, from 4 years of handling, and said, I made this one. Papa made the first one, but I made mine myself. You can have it if you want. Mira's throat. Again. She signed, slowly, clearly, so that Lyra could follow the shape of it. I would be honored. Lyra handed it over with the profound seriousness of someone completing an important transaction. Then, she looked at her father. She said, She's very quiet. Amerik said, She's the loudest person I've ever met. Lyra looked back at Mira, who was standing at the base of the stairs, with a child's wooden whistle in her scarred hand, and her unscarred hand at her side, and the morning light of a new keep falling across her face, which she could feel doing something she couldn't quite control. She signed, to Lyra, in the private, small language that was hers and was going to become someone else's, too. I will teach you more. Lyra, watching her hands with total concentration. More talking? She nodded. Lyra, all of it? She looked at Amerik. He was looking at her with the amber gold eyes, and the old scar through the eyebrow, and the particular expression she had not quite been able to look at directly since the first morning in the courtyard, the expression that was too large for a sideways glance and required full attention, and she was giving it now, full and undefended. She signed, to him, all of it. He said, translating for Lyra, but not taking his eyes off her face. All of it. She stood in his keep, with a child's whistle in her hand, and the road's cold still on her coat, and the smell of pine forest and winter at her shoulder, and the whole enormous, improbable weight of everything she had built in silence. And she thought, the mute servant girl is still here. The mute servant girl has always been here. She was here when the court laughed, here when she cleared the plates, here when she kept the fire in the lean-to. For 9 days in a winter, so cold it froze the water before she could heat it. Here, when she built a language from nothing in a hall that wouldn't listen. She has been here the entire time. The only thing that changed was who was paying attention. And the powerful man at her shoulder had been paying attention for 3 years, learning her words in secret, waiting in patience and small impatience, carrying a whistle on his belt that his daughter made and his daughter loved. And he had crossed a banquet hall and bowed to her, not because it was strategic, and not because it was charitable, but because she was real, and she had saved him, and she was there, and he had been looking. The morning came all the way through. If her story moved something in you, that longing of being finally found, finally heard, then stay a while longer. There are more tales where silence broke open into thunder, where the unwanted became undeniable, where the most powerful creature in the realm knelt in the dust because one quiet heart had earned it. I'll be here. The next story is waiting, and it knows your name.